Y ahora pasamos vamos a hacer una inversión en el programa, a las recomendaciones sobre protección de datos. Y tiene la palabra el señor Hugh Stevenson, director adjunto de la sección internacional de protección al consumidor de los Estados Unidos, de la Federal Trade Commission de los Estados Unidos.
Thank you very much, and it is certainly a privilege to be able to speak to all of you today. I work at the United States Federal Trade Commission, which actually deals with issues involving consumer protection and privacy of consumers as part of that. And I've also done some academic work on comparative European and American data privacy. And so John Wilson had asked me to say a few words about this topic that we have, I think, listed as data protection. The topic, as a number of the speakers already have noted in their comments, it covers a large universe here, a large universe of subjects when we're talking about data privacy. Covers a large universe of laws, and indeed covers a large universe of international organizations that have had some part in looking at privacy or data privacy. It might be helpful here, I think, if I may, to draw a few distinctions analytically that might be helpful to the discussion that has been going on here. When we think about protecting the privacy of personal information, we think about protecting it as to the private sector, as to the commercial entities and what they do with data, and then also as to the public sector, the government, what government can do with data it accesses, when it has to share it with others, what duties it has to protect that data. And obviously particularly relevant to the discussion today is the privacy as to government and how governments handle data that they get. And if we start with that piece, there are, if you will, a couple of strategies that you have for government to provide some kind of protection. One strategy deals with access. So a lot of the conversation today is about data access for obviously good government purposes, but there is a strategy of limiting access in certain cases to protect privacy, protect personal information. There is a strategy of what use government can make of data once it has that data, which has some impact on the protection of a person's data and a person's privacy. And then a third strategy is security. In other words, what do you do to ensure that those who aren't supposed to have data don't get access to it? Key example would be IT security, computer security, cyber security, those kinds of things. So there are these different strategies that can be used when we're thinking about protecting personal information. I think we should also bear in mind that in addition to thinking about what categories we're talking about analytically, there is the challenge of the language we use here to talk about these things. The session, I think, is called Data Protection. And data protection in English, when we say data protection, is actually often a term of art that doesn't mean more generally just protecting privacy in various ways, but refers to a certain legal approach, particularly developed in Europe. Also, in I think there's certain countries, Argentina, for example, that has something that one might call data protection or protección de datos personales. And so that phrase, I think, is often a term of art, although analytically it may cover a broader range of things. And I think that's important to bear in mind in thinking about what exactly are we talking about, should we be talking about here? What part of that are we talking about? In the United States, in terms of, and using the term more generally, in protecting personal privacy, let us say, there are a couple of strategies that are used in our law. I think my colleague had referred earlier to the U.S. Privacy Act and Freedom of Information Act. And in the Freedom of Information Act, somewhat similar to the Uruguayan handout, I noticed that lists various sort of you have various exceptions to that general right of access. And under the U.S. law, there are a couple of them that deal with where there is a need to look at balancing the personal privacy interests with the interests of good government, the interests that underlie the information access law itself. And in fact, there are several of the exceptions that relate in some way to that. In particular, there's one for personnel and medical files, are two examples, and similar files, the disclosure of which would constitute a clearly unwarranted invasion of personal privacy. So this is looking at, in the context of information access, where is the access something that causes a problem? So thinking about the access strategy, limiting access that one otherwise might have under information access laws in the interest of protecting personal privacy. Another area, obviously, where the laws can have effect and that have received quite a bit of attention recently is in the area of data security, which is relevant both for government use of data and for private use of data. I think one can read every day in some paper about some data breach, some loss of data, whether it's a loss of data by a government agency. There's some fairly spectacular examples, or loss of data just by commercial actors who lose a tape, who lose a disk, who have their website hacked and that kind of thing. So that is another area where there's a possibility of protecting privacy, and I think that's one strategy that does come up, for example, in the U.S. so-called Privacy Act of 1974. And as to data use, there may also be limits on how the data that government collects can be used. And part of the strategy for having those limits is, again, to limit the use of that data and the sharing of that data so that it's not misused, lost, otherwise used to impose on individuals. In the United States, there's an example of a particular law that involves limits on doing computer matching of different databases. In other words, taking one database, matching it with another database. It's a strategy on use that, again, is to protect, in the larger sense of the term, protect the personal privacy of individuals. By way of contrast, I probably should also mention something about the larger private sector and the laws more generally on privacy. You do have, as I mentioned, laws in some countries that are, using this term of art, more data protection approaches, which really are laws that define certain controls, not just on access to data, but also on its use, the use of personal data and where it can be used. And that approach is particularly related often to a directive from 1995 in the European Union, a data protection directive on the use of, on limits on the use of data there. More generally internationally, there have been several international organizations that have for a long time focused on privacy and related data uses. The OECD, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, in 1980 had a set of guidelines on the protection of privacy and transporter data flows, one issue being there how data crosses borders, how we protect it as it moves around. Obviously, it was true then, and increasingly true. It's very difficult to limit the movement of data within a particular country or even within a particular region. And so there is renewed interest in various privacy subjects internationally. At the OECD, there's a project for the so-called global dialogue on information information privacy. APEC, the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum, has also done a set of guidelines on privacy framework, and there is a Council of Europe Convention on the treatment of automated data, and so there are these entities out there that have articulated relatively general principles as to the treatment of data. Within, and particularly within Europe, you've had more specialized sort of articulation of data, particularly limits on the treatment of data by the commercial sector. This is probably the subject that is, my personal view, is sort of farthest away, in a sense, from what we've been talking about here, as opposed to the strategy of what public protections there are of personal privacy. As I said, a number of these international organizations are addressing privacy issues now in the OECD, the kind of global privacy dialogue. In APEC, looking particularly at commercial sector data transfer issues. There are also several other entities. There's one called the International Conference of Data Protection and Privacy Commissioners, which focus in particular on general data principles with, again, some focus on the commercial sector. There is a project that the United States, Canada, and Mexico have on looking at data privacy laws. We had the presentation earlier touching on that, on the developments in Mexico there. So there are these several international organizations focusing particularly on issues that touch on the broader subject, including the commercial sector. Obviously, the most relevant part, I think, here is particularly the strategies involving the use of data as to governments. And there are, in these international settings, a number of upcoming conferences in which certainly the widest possible international participation is encouraged. We at the Federal Trade Commission are working with both the OECD and APEC, for example, to do a conference on international aspects of data security, the issue of preventing unauthorized data access. And we're planning that here in Washington for this spring in March. And certainly if there are member states who are interested in that, we would welcome that kind of participation. I know we had a number of OAS member states participate when we last did a conference jointly sponsored with OECD, and actually thank John Wilson for helping coordinate that input. And the other fora are also developing projects. I'm not personally aware of something that has quite the same focus as I think the discussion here has taken about the scope of the information protections vis-a-vis the information access laws. But certainly there is a larger conversation of which, in a sense, this strikes me at least as a sort of specialized part. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, señor director adjunto Hugh Stevenson. Las preguntas van a ser hechas posteriormente a la videoconferencia que estamos por conectar en este momento.